Hello, everybody. I'm James Balfour from the University of Glasgow, and it's a delight to be speaking at the CADAAD conference. Hopefully, I'll see some of you later this week in Italy. So I'm here to give a talk entitled Mad or Bad? Representations of Borderline Personality Disorder on the BPDlovedones subreddit. And if that all sounds like gobbledygook to you, then you've come to the right talk. So before I can ask the question, how are people with BPD, borderline personality disorder, represented? We first need to establish what BPD is. And I know what you're thinking. You're probably thinking, what's that? But if, like me, you fail to escape from the ubiquitous reporting of the Johnny Depp court trial, then you've probably encountered the diagnosis already in the media in relation to this woman, Amber Heard. Because during that trial, a clinical psychologist diagnosed her as having the disorder, and for a period of time, the media, particularly the tabloid media, took quite a lot of interest in the disorder. So you might have come across this headline from the Daily Mail. Clinical psychologist who diagnosed Amber Heard with borderline personality disorder reveals symptom of the condition is like dressing like people she wants to be around days after actress was accused of copying Johnny Depp's courtroom outfits. So you can see that the Mail here, journalists are looking at the disorder with a bit of curiosity and have repackaged some of these actually quite complex symptoms in a popularized manner, dressing like people she wants to be around. You had other headlines such as Dr. Max Pemberton, 1 in 20 of us has a personality disorder like the one experts say Amber Heard has. So just to repeat, there has been some recent discussion around the disorder, even if the general public are quite unfamiliar with the diagnosis. Okay, so we've established that BPD has quite recently been discussed in the media, but what actually is it? Well, when we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the sort of the guidebook for clinicians, we find that BPD is a lot more complex than just dressing like other people. In particular, BPD is what's called a personality disorder, as is evident in the diagnosis, BPD, borderline personality disorder. Personality disorders are defined by the DSM as patterns in thinking or behaviour that are at odds, they're at loggerheads with the expectations of one's culture. And that's the broad definition that they give. I don't think it's an unproblematic term. And in fact, the DSM actually explicitly says that more research needs to be done into personality disorders. BPD is one of 10 listed in the DSM. Others include more recognizable personality disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, which is a separate disorder to BPD. So BPD in particular is described as having a few essential features, which include a pervasive pattern of instability of interpersonal relationships, instability of self-image, instability of affect, so emotions, and marked impulsivity. So these are the main symptoms that are listed for BPD. So 9 criteria are then listed, the first of which is that BPD is characterized by and I think this is the crux, by the way, of what BPD is. It can seem very sort of complicated at first, but this, I think, is the crux of what BPD is. It is characterized by frantic efforts to avoid real or imagined abandonment. So people diagnosed with BPD are often incredibly sensitive to any hint, any suggestion of abandonment. And the example that's given in the DSM is, for example, if someone's a few minutes late to a meeting, 1 or 2 minutes late, say, that can be perceived by someone with a disorder as abandonment, and can provoke quite a significant and serious reaction in them. And related to this fear of abandonment is a pattern of unstable and intense interpersonal relationships characterized by alternating between extremes of idealization and devaluation. So people diagnosed with this disorder can often idealize caregivers or loved ones, and that's that sort of that intense sense of interpersonal relationships. They can idealize caregivers and loved ones, but when people with a disorder perceive abandonment, for example, being a few minutes late to a meeting, this can trigger devaluation. So someone can be perceived as a caregiver can be perceived as an incredibly good person, but can very quickly be devalued and seen as a bad person. And this is what characterizes BPD. It's mainly about interpersonal relationships. People with BPD often struggle to have longer lasting relationships with people because of this idealization, devaluation cycle that can occur. So now, onto the dataset, the BPDlovedones subreddit. For those of you who are unfamiliar with Reddit, Reddit is an online forum which is divided into subreddits, which are smaller communities based around particular topics, particular areas of interest. These communities are moderated by selected members of those communities, and it's structured in such a way that someone can post a link or a photo or make a statement or ask a question, and people then post comments below that. These posts can be upvoted and that changes, or downvoted, and that changes how these posts are viewed on the site. So one of those subreddits, one of those specific communities is the BPDlovedones subreddit, and this is for, so I'll read the about section. The BPDlovedones is a support forum and a safe space for people to discuss the challenges and abuse they have endured at the hands of someone who has borderline personality disorder. This subreddit is an abuse support forum. So already some of these people in this group are going to have an axe to grind. It currently has 5.9 60,000 members, most of which are made up of people who have been in relationships with people with BPD. So there are family members on there, and there are caregivers, but it's almost always people that have been in relationships. And again, going back to earlier, remember this cycle of idealization and devaluation. Obviously, a lot of these people are going to be making sense of what's been going on in their relationships. So my research question is, how do members of the BPDlovedones subreddit use language to represent people with BPD? And there you can see an image of how it's laid out. You can see the about section there. You can see the name of the subreddit up here. And then you've got posts and comments underneath. You can see these can be upvoted. So very quickly, in terms of the data and method, I collected posts and comments from the subreddit that were posted between the 1st of December and the 14th of December 2020. So this is only a 2-week period. And this was quite a significant period because, remember, this is the middle of lockdown. It was a difficult time for many of us, and I know a lot of relationships were strained anyway. So members of this forum are often writing at a time when they're in quite sort of an intimate sort of environment with their partner with BPD. The files were then cleaned, so I removed things like usernames. There was lots of numbers from the upvoting system, and then I split them into individual files, which resulted in a corpus containing 7,480 posts and comments and 713,000 tokens. And this is a lot of words for only a 2-week period, and really demonstrates how active this forum is. There are lots of posts, even on a daily basis. In terms of my method to observe interesting patterns in the data, I generated 96 keywords using the BNC spoken corpus as a reference corpus. And as other people have said previously, internet fora contain lots of features of spoken language. So using a spoken corpus is often more helpful than using just a corpus of written communication. To generate keywords, I use a combination of the log ratio effect size metric and the log likelihood significance metric. Keywords, all keywords had a log likelihood score of above 15.13, which ensured that I had a 99.9% confidence that these words were not, these observed frequency differences were not due to random variation in the data. And I used a dispersion threshold at 3%. So keywords had to be included, had to occur in at least 3% of these 7,000 posts and comments. This was very important because a lot of these posts contain very long narratives, and I wouldn't want it to be the case that these keywords just appeared in one or two posts, for instance. Finally, on to some interesting findings. This is very much work in progress. Today I'm just going to talk about two aspects that have emerged, two issues, I should say, that have emerged from my analysis so far. And these are, first, that members observe similarities between narratives to distill the essence of what people with BPD are like. And secondly, that members draw on the vocabulary of the authentic and moral self to understand the symptom of an unstable self-image. So the main function of this subreddit is for users to share their personal experiences, their interpersonal experiences with people with BPD. And one of the main emphases that I've found by looking through this list of keywords is that people express surprise about similarities across the stories. And members are often looking for similarities across the stories. So we take, for instance, a keyword like crazy, which occurs 289 times. At first, I thought crazy. Of course, these members are referring to people with BPD as crazy. But when we look at the concordance lines, we see that crazy is not being used in that way. It's being used as an expression of an opinion, of an evaluation. So it's crazy how similar the stories are here. It's crazy how these are the same for most people. And another keyword which is relevant here is its, which, as you can see, also occurs in these examples, and it's used as a sort of as a dummy subject. It is used to introduce personal evaluations, which again tend to relate to the similarity across stories. So it's insane to continue to read these posts and realize these people with BPD are almost like painting by numbers. Painting by numbers, the suggestion is that their behaviour is so predictable by looking at the patterns across these stories. And by looking at the similarities across these stories, users try to distill this essence of what people with BPD are and what they're like. And this does not always align with the clinical literature which we've previously discussed. So a keyword is there, which is a possessive determiner. It's not coded in the singular, it's a plural possessive determiner. It's not referring to particular individuals, but groups of individuals. Also, they fuck so many people over, they leave a trail of tears and enemies in their wake. So by looking at these commonalities across the stories, users are trying to generalize what people with BPD are like. This did not appear in the clinical literature that we covered. Again, you look at a word like BPD, which is obviously very frequent in the dataset, 1,489 times, and in 100 cases, there's reference to a BPD, which is this essentializing phrase. Self-reflection for a BPD isn't pretty or something they want to partake in. So to repeat, my point is users are looking for similarities across these stories to establish what BPD is. However, this isn't a representative sample of what people with BPD are like. This is, as I said at the beginning, an abuse forum. This is for people who've experienced very negative interpersonal relationships with people with BPD. So it's not accurate to generalize from these experiences. And this is something I'll be looking into in more detail in the future. Perhaps the most interesting thing that I found so far in the data is this emphasis on selfhood. And what we find is that members allude to people with BPD having this uninhibited sense of identity. If you remember when we looked through the symptoms at the beginning from the DSM, an unstable sense of self-image was listed as one of the criteria. So we have the word self, which occurs as a keyword. It occurs 640 times, and it occurs in patterns such as sense of self, with pre-modifiers such as unstable, shifting, and any, so they don't have any sense of self. We also have of self and pre-modifiers such as loss, lack, and fragility. And these occur in phrases such as, it's so obvious once you've been through it all, that they really lack any sense of self. And this can be quite difficult for people to grasp. For many of us, we're quite comfortable. We have a clear idea of who we are, and witnessing people who seem to alternate between different selves, which maybe are shaped by the people that people with BPD spend time with. This can seem quite difficult for us to grasp. And indeed, it seems quite difficult for the members of the forum to grasp, because paradoxically, the members of the forum understand BPD through this conventional vocabulary of an authentic self. When we look at the keyword self, it occurs around words to do with authenticity. So members talk about a true self. They talk about a real self. It occurs in examples. They were fake and manipulative. As he got older, his real self was around more and more often because he didn't want to even try to disguise himself. So although people with BPD may have an unstable sense of self, members of this forum are looking for a real self and trying to identify it. So they construct these people as having a real self and having a false self. The false self was the self that they witnessed being in that relationship, for instance. The false self is something else, being fake and manipulative. Another example, I feel as though that's their true self, disconnected, lonely, negative, and at times stunningly cruel, not necessarily a good person, to be honest. So we have an evaluative judgment here, good person. And this brings me on to my next point, which is that people with BPD are also understood through the conventional vocabulary of the moral self. So members of the forum are not just looking for real and false selves, they're looking for good and bad selves. So another keyword is person. I told you there's quite an emphasis on identity in this forum. And we have references to a good person and a bad person. And other words occur as well, such as callous, angrious, disgusting, evil, even person. I don't think she's a bad person. She seemed like a genuinely good person. So these statements aren't necessarily always negative, but we've established that members of the forum are looking at these people in terms of authenticity and in terms of morality. And in these posts and comments, morality and authenticity interact, and members often draw on metaphors in order to try and conceptualize this. So you have some members who argue that the good self is the authentic self, and this exists beneath the bad self. So I want to stay because the person underneath it all is wonderful. Is one of the reasons you stay with your person with BPD is because you feel they are a good person trapped inside their disease. So there you have quite an interesting spatial metaphor. But on the opposite end of things, you have people who argue that the bad self is the authentic self, and this exists beneath the good self, which is itself fraudulent. She's just not a good person. I fell in love with the character. The real her is as disgusting as a human can be. And then you have even more complicated examples where the good self that exists inside the bad self is itself fraudulent, is itself a trap. The good person inside is a trap. So you can see how members of this forum are drawing on these binary notions of authenticity and falsity and morality and immorality to understand people with a shifting sense of self. So to conclude, users of the BPDlovedones subreddit discussed shared experiences with people assumed to be diagnosed with BPD to identify commonalities. These commonalities are used to distill the essence of what people with BPD are like, and this is problematic in a sense because this is an abuse forum, and of course, and people have an axe to grind to this forum and will look for particular patterns which reaffirm their biases, and this leads, of course, to stigmatizing representations of the disorder that can't necessarily be extrapolated to all people. Another problem is that through the group, users obtain these linguistic resources for framing people with BPD in terms of both moral and authentic selves, and this is used to understand this idea of an unstable sense of self. So there are two problems that I've identified in the data already. Okay, well that's the end, and there are some references as well to follow up. I will see you all later at the conference.